Hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. This is the first event we've done here at the Bluebell, and it's an experiment basically. It's to see what happens when we kind of bring together two worlds. You know, we provide a platform for music for people to connect and to get to know each other, and also to provide a platform for people to learn new things, new interesting ideas, things that might plant some seeds of curiosity for change on a local and maybe a global level. So we've basically put together, invited a whole bunch of speakers for you tonight, and I hope you'll find the information valuable. There's some really interesting topics that's going to be discussed. So the talks are running a little bit later than planned, so it's probably going to run for around about a 4-hour block. The talks, there'll be a little 15-minute break in between each chunk. So there's around 2 speakers, they'll have a little 15-minute break. And just time to have a natter, perhaps, it's an opportunity to discuss some of the topics with your neighbours, meet some new friends, it's like we're all here together, so it'd be nice to meet each other. And and then there'll be a next block, so there's 3 blocks of speakers, and then after that, this room's going to basically transform into a kind of all-night jam session. We've got some amazing musicians coming later, some really skilled musicians and some really crazy instruments, which you'll all like to hear. I'd like to introduce you to Lauren first. Lauren's going to be hosting this kind of speaker's corner for the day. I'm very grateful for her coming up. She's got an amazing story, so make sure you stick around for her talk later. And over to you, Lauren. Thanks.
Thank you, and just a big thank you to Ollie for arranging this day. It's going to be absolutely amazing. So thank you, Ollie. So our first speaker, I feel really short right now. Okay, hang on, there we go. Our first speaker is Jack. So Jack is a really interesting guy. He's an anthropologist. And he's done research mostly around the paranormal and religious experiences. And he's here today to talk to us about belief in spirits and also ecological regeneration. I'm really excited to hear about Jack today. So can we put our hands together and welcome Jack to the stage.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
I'll just put this up a little bit. Okay, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself first before I crack into this, which it might be a bit ambitious, but we'll see how it goes. I'm an anthropologist, and I did my doctoral research with the University of Bristol. And basically what I did over the period of about 7 years was research a group of spirit mediums in Bristol called the Bristol Spirit Lodge. And I was an ethnographic participant observer, basically. I went through this process of mediumship development with them and experienced a bunch of weird stuff, and then basically wrote it up, and that's how I got my PhD. So that's very good. In the last couple of years, I've been thinking a lot more about the ecological crisis. In 2016, I started working with a permaculture teacher called Steve Jones on the One School, One Planet project, which is basically developing a permaculture curriculum for secondary schools. And as I was doing this, I started to notice, talking to people and interviewing some people, that there was some weird paranormal currents going on among permaculture practitioners, which was interesting. And I kind of pursued that now, and what I'm going to present to you today is kind of like an overview of the introduction I've written to a book that I'm editing at the moment. So it's kind of going to be a little bit reedy, but hopefully not too reedy. Okay, so here we go. You might not be able to see these slides, but I've got some slides as well. Okay, so we're at a critical moment in the history of humankind's relationship with the Earth and all the species that co-inhabit with us. Throughout the 20th century and into the 21st, we've continually and often deliberately ignored the warning signs of the ecological catastrophe we're now facing. 2018, so the World Meteorological Organization recently announced, was the 4th hottest year on record, closely followed by 2017, 2016 and 2015. Indeed, the 20 warmest years since records began in 1850 have been in the last 22 years. So who knows what this next coming year is going to hold, and the years that follow. On top of this, the WMO also reports that global greenhouse gas emissions are at their highest levels yet, in spite of the efforts and agreements of governments around the world to reduce them. And when this is combined with a dramatic loss of animal species over the last 50 years, up to as many as 60% of species according to the WWF, and that if we add onto this again the continued deforestation of vast swathes of ancient woodland, then we're presented with a very grim picture indeed. And basically it comes down to this: something needs to be done, but actually something really should have been done a long time ago. And sociologist Bruno Latour puts it like this: he said, "We haven't lacked for warnings, the sirens have been blaring all along, but basically we've ignored them." Okay, so we're in this crisis situation. But there are some promising signs that we've started to wake up to the reality that we've created for ourselves. From the bottom-up perspective, there's already literally hundreds of grassroots regenerative ecology projects springing up all over the place, on every continent of the world, more or less. And the youth strikes for climate that have been taking place all over the world, inspired by Greta Thunberg, her Skollstrike for Klimatet, outside the Swedish Parliament, are also raising awareness about the ecological crisis. And then you can add on to that again all of the activity we've seen with Extinction Rebellion in London, and all of these small Extinction Rebellion groups popping up in towns and cities across the world. Okay, so we seem to be waking up to something. There's also some promising signs from a top-down perspective that we're waking up to this as well. And one of the most interesting is the Paris Climate Agreement. So this was agreed in December 2015, and it was signed and ratified in April 2016 by 195 countries, and America's kind of trying to pull itself out of it, but that's up to them. But this agreement was basically a major stepping stone in that it represents an international scientific consensus on climate change, basically saying that it's real, that human beings bear the brunt of responsibility, and that we need to, and that we actually can do something about it. Okay, so this graph basically shows what we need to do over the next, basically 30 years. We need to reduce our CO2 emissions globally, obviously. We need to do that in 50% increments over the next 30 years, which is going to be very difficult, because you think all of the easy things that we would, the easy approaches to reducing carbon will already have been done in the next 10 years. So it's going to get increasingly difficult the further on we get. But this is a process that's going to involve really radical social, cultural and economic transformations. Okay, we're looking at basically a whole new culture that we need. Okay, so at least at first this is going to be driven by the need to reduce these CO2 emissions, but I think eventually it's going to have to change into something else. It's going to have to move away from being a purely kind of scientific approach towards something a little bit more cultural. And a lot of us may have seen this slide about, but this guy, Gus Beth, is an environmental lawyer, and he basically said, "I used to think the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse and climate change. I thought that with 30 years of good science we could address those problems, but I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed and apathy, and to deal with those we need a spiritual and cultural transformation, and we scientists don't know how to do that." Okay, so this is where I think different disciplines like anthropology and the humanities might be able to add something more to this issue. And it also leads us directly to the paranormal. Obviously. Okay. So, all this talk of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the urgent need for practical action might well seem a million miles away from the fringe topic of the paranormal. It might. And it may at first be difficult to see anyway that a re-engagement with the paranormal might help us to make sense of and overcome these sort of very frightening global threats. Okay? But in the spirit of the need for creative exploration, this is actually precisely what I'm suggesting with this talk, that approaches emerging from the study of and engagement with the supernatural may ultimately help us to reconnect with the natural, and in so doing develop innovative approaches to confronting the eco-crisis. Okay? So my talk is going to kind of skim over quite a lot of this, because it's from the introduction to my book, but I hope that you'll get the kind of the gist of where I'm aiming with this stuff. So in a sense, what I'm suggesting is that the ontological assumptions underlying the rejection of the paranormal by mainstream culture, so that's the kind of ideas that make us want to reject the paranormal, are also the kinds of ideas that make us damage the planet, basically. Okay? And hopefully you'll see how this makes sense soon. Okay? Where am I? So what I'm suggesting is that if we really want to change our behaviour, we're going to have to change the way that we think about our place in the cosmos. And the paranormal teaches us a lot about this. There are other approaches as well that take a similar kind of perspective. There's transpersonal ecology, transpersonal ecosophy. Paul Devereaux wrote a really cool book in the 90s called Revisioning the Earth, taking this kind of Earth mysteries perspective. But this is my contribution. So I'm going to start off by thinking about religion, okay? Always a good topic. Okay, so with approximately 2.2 billion Christians, 1.6 billion Muslims, 1 billion Hindus, and nearly 500 million Buddhists, 14 million Jews, and not to mention all those people who participate in indigenous folk and new religious movements. When we're invoking this category of religion, we're actually invoking something that is really vast. We're talking about a demographic that literally encircles the entire globe. And if even a fraction of these faith communities, as eclectic and diverse as they are, was to take up ecologically regenerative practices like permaculture, agroforestry, community gardening, wildlife restoration, and all these kinds of things, and the important point is made meaningful to their lives by their cosmological models, we consider the huge impact that it could have on the global system. Fortunately, since the 1980s, there's been a growing awareness of anthropogenic climate change amongst the major world religions, and there's also been a rise of religiously motivated ecological restoration projects. Some have referred to this phenomenon as the greening of religion. Okay, and in the build-up to the United Nations Paris Climate Summit in 2015, the major world religions, or representatives of them, put out these climate declarations. Okay, and Pope Francis put out his first encyclical, his first independent encyclical, because he'd had this weird thing where he took over from a still living pope, which is weird. But anyway, this encyclical he issued was expressly concerned with issues of sustainable development, runaway consumerism, global warming, and environmental destruction. And this is what he said: I urgently appeal for a new dialogue about how we're shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we're undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. Okay, I'm not saying that we should listen to the Pope necessarily, but this is what he said. A central connecting feature of many of these statements issued by the major world religions is an emphasis on a holistic, organic, or relational image of the world, which highlights the interconnectedness of all life on Earth. So if we take the Hindu Declaration on Climate Change, Bhumi Devi Yai Ka, for example, it suggests that all elements of reality are organs of God's body. The entire universe is to be looked upon as the energy of the Lord. Okay? I'm not going to go into too much detail about these ideas now, but suffice to say that at this point, the potentials for both affecting social and cultural change and practically regenerating ecosystems framed in cosmological models like this are enormous. So we can think models of the universe as a living system that's imbued with intelligence and agency, of which we're all a part, are valuable alternatives to the mainstream models of reductionist and materialist science, which have actively contributed to the collapse of our global ecosystems. So perhaps what I'm suggesting is that we need something that's totally radically different to the way that we've been thinking in the past. Everyone okay for now? So this is where we start to think about the paranormal a bit more. So just as the faith communities of the world's religions represent an opportunity for climate change mitigation, so too might what we call the paranormal milieu. Okay, so if recent surveys are anything to go by, belief in and experiences of the paranormal are remarkably common in the Western world. Recently published was the Chapman University's Survey of American Fears, which suggests that paranormal beliefs are actually on the rise in the United States. I don't know why. The survey suggests that 57.7% of the US population believe that places can be haunted by spirits, okay, which is an increase of 11% since 2016. So something weird's going on. And 75.9% of the US population holds some form of paranormal belief. Interestingly though, this survey, the Chapman Survey of American Fears, also revealed that only 53% of the population is actually afraid of global warming and climate change. So based on these figures, it would appear that there are more paranormal believers than people worried about the damage we've inflicted on the global ecosystem. So is there a way that we could perhaps address the balance on this somehow? What if this paranormal demographic could also be tapped into for climate change mitigation? So just as we talk about the greening of religion, maybe we could also talk of a greening of the paranormal. And this might sound a bit fanciful, and it's kind of meant to. But what if every time Sasquatch research groups went on an expedition into the wilderness, they also planted trees to rebuild habitat? Or lake monster researchers work to improve water quality? Or when ghost hunting organisations conduct vigils in abandoned hospitals, they also plant wildflower seeds to enhance biodiversity? Could happen. What if UFO spotters set up community gardens for late night stargazing? Consider all of these possibilities. So, on a very practical level, appealing to the sheer number of paranormal enthusiasts out there to get involved in regenerative efforts could potentially yield very positive outcomes. And as fun as this sounds, this isn't actually what I'm talking about. What I'm really talking about is something that's a little bit deeper, actually quite a lot deeper. So what I'm suggesting is that we try to engage with the other end of the religious spectrum. So we can think of religion as a spectrum of phenomena that runs from doctrine and belief on the one hand all the way to experience and emotion and all that kind of stuff on the other hand, for religious experience. And this is what William James, the famous American philosopher, called personal religion. And I like his definition of personal religion as the feelings, acts and experiences of individuals in their solitude so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. Okay? The reason I like this broad definition of personal religion is that it could also encompass atheistic and non-religious worldviews as well, which could equally be conceived as a rejection of the divine, however we want to define it. So when William James is talking about personal religion, he's talking about our kind of inner convictions, really. And it's very different from the kind of religion we talk about when we look at the church or the Bible and things like that. Another way that we could refer to this element of religion is spirituality. Here's a definition of spirituality that I think is really quite useful. It was given by David Hay and Rebecca Nye in a study of children's spirituality. And they explain that spirituality is the potential to be much more deeply aware of ourselves and our intimate relationship with everything that is not ourselves. So we take this kind of broad view of spirituality, then we can see how useful it could be for very directly affecting the way that we interact with the world. I should also add, when we start to think about spirituality and religion in this kind of way from an experiential perspective, we end up with a whole load of things that we might not expect popping up. So things like ghosts and all sorts of weird experiences that people have. And there's a useful term for this that I really like called ordinary theology, which is basically the idea that real people build up their own kind of theological or ontological models based on their own experiences. And that's cool. Okay. There's also this element of religion that kind of springs up spontaneously from ecological participation. So people who interact with the environment on a regular basis very often develop a kind of a spirituality based on their experiences in nature. And the sociologist Bron Taylor has referred to this as dark green religion. He traces tendrils of dark green religion right back into the 1960s counterculture and all of that. So pretty interesting stuff. And he basically summarizes this idea of dark green religion as a value system that's based on a felt kinship with the rest of life, often derived from a Darwinian understanding that all forms of life have evolved from a common ancestor and are therefore related. That's accompanied by feelings of humility and the corresponding critique of human moral superiority, often inspired or reinforced by a science-based cosmology that reveals how tiny human beings are in the universe, and 3, reinforced by a metaphysics of interconnection and the idea of interdependence, mutual influence and reciprocal dependence found in the sciences, especially ecology and physics. So what's interesting about dark green religion is that it draws its kind of vitality from ecology. A lot of the people that Taylor talks about in his book on dark green religion came to their perspectives following kind of what we could call, I suppose, like mystical experiences in nature. So this guy, Aldo Leopold, you may have heard of him. He's kind of like the father of conservation ecology, really. Widely regarded as the father of modern wildlife conservation. Experienced a radical transformation of perspective following an encounter with a wolf he'd shot. So in the 1920s, he was a wildlife warden, and his responsibility, he was given the job by the government to go out and shoot wolves. And he didn't really think about it much. He would go out and he would kill the wolves. Until one day he actually came up to one of these wolves that was still alive. And this is what he said. "We reached the old wolf in time to watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then, full of trigger itch. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view." So he kind of comes to this transformation of perspective through mystical experience. A connection between transformative religious and mystical experiences and the natural world has long been recognized in the scholarly literature of religion. And one of the major categories of mystical experience, if you ever happen to be reading about it, is extroverted mystical experience. And the scholar of mysticism, William W.T. Stace, defines this as follows. "The extroverted mystic, with his physical senses, continues to perceive the same world of trees and hills and tables and chairs as the rest of us, but he sees these objects transfigured in such manner that the unity shines through them. The extroverted experience is sensory intellectual insofar as it still perceives physical objects, but is non-sensuous and non-intellectual insofar as it perceives them as all one." So basically he's saying that these kinds of mystical experiences, we see a kind of a oneness emerging through the multiplicity of our reality. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre. You might not have done. But it's in Lampeter, so it's in Wales, which is cool. They've got a collection of over 6,000 accounts of self-submitted religious experiences that people have just sent in since the 1940s, 50s. Which is pretty cool. And I was looking through it, trying to find examples of extroverted mystical experience, and I found these two examples that I'll read out, just to show this connection between participating in ecology and having extraordinary experiences. So here's one from a male in fact they're both from the 1940s. "As I watched, suddenly the whole countryside changed, and everything in it, without exception, simply glowed with luminous light. It seemed no longer to be lit by the sun, but by its own internal radiance. Sunlight was not reflected from it, but I myself and everything else seemed to have become light, which now interpenetrated and shone through our previously dense physical forms. The whole scene shone with an extraordinary golden glow, which included the sky and the atmosphere itself." And here's another example. "As we conversed, the situation became unreal. The plants and shrubs and the three pine trees in a copse became unreal, and yet they were more real than I had ever seen them in the 3.5 years I had lived there. Instead of merging into a general familiar pattern, each item of plant, shrub and tree stood out singularly, vivid, vibrant. The whole area became something on its own apart from the rest. The whole area became something I had never seen before. I became filled with a feeling of elation and well-being such as I've never before or since experienced. I felt that I had seen nature as it really is." Okay? So that's just two examples. So there's literally hundreds of examples of people's experiences of deep connection with nature. With these experiences, I don't know how long am I talking for? Is everyone okay?
Have you finished?
I haven't finished, no.
What's it called? 140 stuff.
Sorry,
What's the name of that place?
oh, the Alistair Hardy Religious Experience Research Centre. It's a good place. About 15 minutes, okay. I'll try and rush through. Okay, so we're moving into the domain of the numinous. This was a category of experience put forward by a theologian in the 1910s called Rudolf Otto. And basically, he said that religious experiences could be reduced down to this numinous feeling. And he split it into the mysterium tremendum and the mysterium fascinans on the one hand. The mysterium tremendum is this kind of feeling of fear and awe and kind of horror at the divine or whatever it is. And the mysterium fascinans is the kind of feeling of being drawn towards it and of elation and beauty and all those kind of things. So he identified these two contrasting elements of religious experience. And especially when we start to talk about the mysterium tremendum and the feeling of awe and fear and those kind of things, then we start to move into the domain of the paranormal again. Okay. So I'm going to talk, I've talked a lot about the paranormal over the last 10 years really, and I've gone into different definitions of it in other places, so that's not really what I want to talk about now. What I want to talk about is the importance of keeping this category open and as broad as possible. So, I mean, there are things in the academic world that are kind of respectable and okay to research. So, to a certain extent, although it's still controversial, things like psi or telepathy and things like that, you can research that in a laboratory setting in a university, and that's fine. But if you want to research something like, I don't know, Bigfoot or UFOs and things like that, there are certain ways that you can go about doing that, but generally that kind of stuff is sidelined. But what I'm trying to say is that we need to include all of that stuff. If we're talking about the paranormal, we don't want to just include the stuff that academia likes us to talk about, we also want to include all of the really weird stuff as well. Okay, so that's basically what I want to say about the paranormal. And I think it's summarized nicely by this idea of high strangeness. This is what I think really characterizes the paranormal. And this was put forward by J. Allen Hynek, who was basically one of the first ufologists. He was the guy who was on Project Blue Book to, apparently find the evidence. Anyway, high strangeness, this is how he defines it. A light seen in the night sky, the trajectory of which cannot be ascribed to a balloon, aircraft, etc., would nonetheless have a low strangeness rating, because there's only one strange thing about the report to explain, its motion. A report of a weird craft that descended within 100 feet of a car on a lonely road, caused the car's engine to die, its radio to stop and its lights to go out, left marks on the nearby ground and appeared to be under intelligent control, receives a high strangeness rating because it contains a number of separate very strange items, each of which outrages common sense. Okay, and that's really what I think is kind of definitive of paranormal experiences, is that they kind of outrage our common sense. And I think maybe we could also argue that to some extent that's what distinguishes paranormal experiences from religious experiences, maybe, that they're just super weird. Whereas religious experiences seem to kind of fit into a cultural framework. So when we start to take extraordinary experiences seriously and open up to the fact that people do have these weird experiences, and we want to think about the implications of those, start to notice some interesting things. So it's commonly reported in accounts of extraordinary experiences that the experiencer comes away from their encounter with an enhanced sense of connection to the environment. So we can look at the work of the psychiatrist John Mack in the 1990s, he was kind of ostracized by the academic community because he was researching alien abductions, and he was at Harvard University, and Harvard kind of did an investigation into him to find out whether he was still a good academic, and he still was a good academic, even though he was researching weird stuff. But anyway, he noticed in his study of abductions that there was this prevailing kind of concern with the ecological crisis bubbling up. And this is what he said: it seems impossible to avoid the observation that the alien abduction phenomenon is occurring in the context of a planetary ecological crisis that is reaching critical proportions, and that information about this situation is often powerfully conveyed by the alien beings to the experiencers. Okay, so that's weird. We can add on to this as well. Individuals who claim to have had contact with extraterrestrial intelligences may go on to develop a closer relationship to their terrestrial ecology, and also to develop a new sense of their place in the cosmos following their experience. I'm just going to say that I'm not necessarily talking about the ontological reality of these things at the moment, although I do think that's important. But the fact that people report this transformation following these experiences is interesting in itself. Similarly, Ring and Valerino have noted parallel effects amongst near-death experiencers, who often develop what they call a heightened sensitivity to the ecological health of the planet following their experiences. Changing patterns of behaviour and worldview have also been noted following other forms of extraordinary experience. For example, lifetime experience with psychedelics in particular may contribute to people's pro-environmental behaviour by changing their self-construal in terms of an incorporation of the natural world. Again, interesting. So at face value, there seems to be some kind of a connection between extraordinary and anomalous experiences and various kinds of ecological consciousness development. Okay, I don't know how long I've got left now, but let's see how I'm taking. 5 minutes. Right. Okay, so in keeping with this kind of thought that I had that we need to turn to high strangeness to kind of bring about cultural change, I just want to talk very quickly about plants. And specifically about the possibility of plants being conscious beings. Because this is the kind of radical shift in perspective that I think we're going to need to kind of shake us out of this deadlock that we're in. So in spite of the dependence of the animal kingdom on plant life on Earth, it's plants after all who draw down energy from the sun, making it usable by animals and humans alike, and who maintain stable atmospheric conditions for us to breathe. We have had a tendency, especially in the dominant Western culture, to disregard plants as unconscious objects, devoid of subjectivity and personhood. And we've tended to assume that we have a right to kind of dominate plants and, to use them for our own purposes. And agriculture, we start to think, starts to look very weird. Anyway, there's a new movement in the science of plants, plant studies basically, called plant neurobiology, which is a very interesting area of research. And Mancuso and Viola are two of the kind of pioneers of this. And they say that there is a compelling body of research that shows that higher order plants really are intelligent, able to receive signals from their environment, process the information, and devise solutions adaptive to their own survival. What's more, they manifest a kind of swarm intelligence that enables them to behave not as an individual, but as a multitude. Okay, so plants, this is coming from people who are at the forefront of plant neurobiology, relatively new field, saying that plants are radically more conscious than we give them credit for. Indeed, plants perform all manner of behaviours that were previously assumed to be hallmarks of the so-called higher animals. Peter Volovan's book, The Hidden Life of Trees, for example, collects together evidence suggesting that trees are in fact social beings who live in communities. They actually look after their young and their elderly by sharing out nutrients amongst themselves. And even the stumps of long-fallen trees continue to be supported with nutrients by the rest of the community. And they also seem to communicate with each other through complex chemical signaling and mycorrhizal fungi networks. So that's interesting. I also would like to draw attention to the work of Monica Gagliano. Again, she's part of this kind of plant neurobiology movement, but her recent book, Thus Spoke the Plant, actually explains how her scientific experiments, like mainstream scientific experiments, have been nudged by her kind of imaginal, or however you want to think of it, spiritual, shamanistic communication with trees and other kinds of plants. And her research has demonstrated that plants are capable of learning and remembering. They're very innovative, interesting experiments published in like Nature and big journals. That plants have the capacity to hear sounds, and that they may also use sound for communication. Her research has helped to solidify the newly emerging field of plant neurobiology, a field of research that was, much like parapsychology's relationship with academic psychology, considered fringe research by mainstream biology until very recently. Okay, so there's been a bit of a shift in biology towards thinking about plants as being more conscious than we ever thought they could be. I'll just briefly skip over these bits, but when we start to find these kind of new, well, not even new, but these findings from science that seem to support plants being more conscious, then it suggests that we have to go back and reevaluate things that people have said in the past that might have been brushed away. So, like the Findhorn Foundation in Scotland, for example, is an organic garden that was set up by a bunch of people who felt that they were in communication with the plant spirits, and the plants were telling them how to do their gardening, and lo and behold, they had an amazing garden, which is interesting. So if new plant neurobiology research supports plant consciousness, then maybe these guys were onto something, maybe. The same could also be said of the research of people like Cleve Baxter in the 1960s, who did all of these interesting experiments with houseplants linked up to basically lie detector machines. Okay? I mean, again, lie detector machines, it's kind of weird science anyway, but perhaps he was onto something. Perhaps he was still connecting or tapping into this same thing. And to make things even more difficult, he also claimed that the plants were telepathically communicating as well, okay, just to make it a little bit more. Okay, I just want to get through the last little bit here now. Okay, so paranormal minds. So what I'm suggesting is that there is a common thread underlying the study of the paranormal and ecology, and that is the issue of trying to comprehend non-human intelligence. So both research areas are confronted with the challenge of understanding different forms of mind and intelligence and making sense of their motivations, from gods and goddesses, poltergeists, fairies, UFO nauts, spirits of the dead and DMT entities, through to animal and plant sentience, the long-range strategies of trees, fungi and mycelium networks, the self-regulating capabilities of the global ecosystem and so on in ecology. So we've got all of these different kinds of, different ways of thinking about possible minds. And I think possibly that ecology and anomalistics is what I'm referring to, all this paranormal stuff. They might have a lot to share with each other. Especially when we start to think about things like the Gaia hypothesis, which is, you know, potentially an example of one of these large-scale non-human minds. The Gaia hypothesis, again, it's still quite a controversial idea. James Lovelock came up with it in the 1970s, basically suggested that the Earth is a self-regulating system. And some people kind of jumped on it because they used this idea of Gaia, and he was invoking the idea of the goddess of the Earth he was only putting a name on it, but scientists didn't like that. They didn't like the fact that he was wrapping it up. They didn't like the idea of nature being teleological. Okay, but maybe it is. John Keel, who was a paranormal researcher, came to similar kinds of ideas about a vast mind, not from studying ecology, but from studying, you know, UFO encounters and experiences. And he said it's quite possible, even probable, that the Earth is really a living organism, and that it in turn is part of an even larger organism, that whole constellations are alive, transmitting and receiving energy to and from other celestial energy sources. Okay, so it's just interesting that you spend enough time researching the paranormal, you spend enough time researching ecology, you kind of end up coming to a similar kind of point. I think animism is a good thing, other than human persons. Sorry. This is a good definition of animism, which will suffice for now. Animists are people who recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. Animism is lived out in various ways that are all about learning to act respectfully, carefully and constructively toward and among other persons. Persons are beings rather than objects who are animated and social towards others, even if they're not always sociable. Animism is more accurately understood as being concerned with learning how to be a good person in a respectful relationship with other persons. So if we start to think of the world as being populated by persons and instead of objects, and that we have to build relationships with them, then in theory, you know, we might start to behave differently. And then I'll skip over all this stuff, but recently rivers have been granted personhood status, which is good. We should be, an important point is that we're not supposed to be, I'm not saying that we should be kind of like wholesale taking other people's cultures and applying it to ourselves. What we need to be doing is building our own new cultures up by reconnecting to place. And if we look at our country and the folklore and the myths and legends, we find that actually already a lot of these places, a lot of the features of the landscape have already been personalised for us, and we just have to start to reconnect with that. You can tie that in with Nessie. Observe and interact. This is how this consciousness manifests to us through participating in it, and that's why we, you know, through gardening and permaculture techniques or whatever, through doing that we build up a relationship and we open ourselves up to these extraordinary experiences. And that then encourages us to engage more. So what I'm suggesting is that there might be some kind of a feedback loop going on. And if we could learn to kind of somehow make use of that, then we could change our culture. We could re-enchant our culture at the same time as rewilding our land. The end.
Oh, thank you very much. That was amazing. Before we started this talk, I didn't know what I don't even know how to say it.
Animism.
Animism was, but that's such a beautiful, that everything is granted personhood, then we can really start to make strides in creating a better world. So thank you so much for that. We have up next the owners and bringers of the new shop 2050. However, they're just going to need a minute to set up, so if anyone has any questions about what we've just heard that they want to have now whilst they're setting up, then you're more than welcome. We've got time for one or two.
Yeah. Are you okay with that?
I am.
Yeah? Great. Should we start with you?
Yep. I was wondering whether, I don't know how to formulate this into a question really, but how much have you studied the ideas of transcendentalism as referring to Henry David Thoreau and
Yeah.
what
Not much, but I know of the.
But it's very similar, what you're saying is very similar to
Yeah,
that.
and in that book, Dark Green Religion, there's a whole chapter dedicated to Thoreau and those guys and Walden and all of that. So it's definitely, it's in the mix.
Right, good.
Any other questions?
That's
Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Can we hear it just once more for Jack? And thank you. Also, just to let you know a little bit of the setup of the talks, so we've got 2 lots of talks and then a 10 to 15 minute break for you guys to get a drink, go to the loo, whatever you need to do, and then another 2 talks. So there's going to be this talk on next, and then there will be a 10-minute break. So